Today we're going to talk about modern terror, specifically how terrorist organizations form and how we stop them. First, let's define what terror is. Terrorism is real or threatened violence that is intended to intimidate or coerce a population, and it targets civilians. This makes it different from an act of war, which is a government sending armed forces to attack other armed forces. Terror specifically kills and attacks and traumatizes civilians. There are a few types of extremism that we can look at. First, let's look at establishment extremism, and this leads to state-sponsored terrorism. So establishment extremism is one country funding another country's terrorist organizations. So an example of this would be the entirety of the Cold War's proxy wars in the Middle East. So the USSR militarily supported terrorist organizations in Afghanistan at the same time that the CIA was funding anti-Soviet terrorist organizations like the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. The next type is revolutionary extremism. These are things like coups d'etats and insurgencies that are overthrowing governments and changing out the leadership. So an example would be the Taliban's movement toward anti-Soviet sentiment, trying to oust the Soviet government, and then in the future trying to get rid of the American-installed government in Afghanistan. Similar but still distinct, sub-revolutionary terrorism is a little bit more insidious and internal. So instead of outsiders or citizens overthrowing the government, sub-revolutionary extremism comes from politicians themselves working to undermine and manipulate sociopolitics, changing laws and policies to be more favorable toward extremist values. Military extremism is when governments are operated by military forces that use terrorist attacks against their own civilian population. Examples of this are Brazil and Chile in the 80s, where military rule targeted their own civilians. And this kind of goes to the Machiavellian view of rule of whether it is better to be feared or loved. Military extremists believe it is better to be feared, and they use terrorist attacks to accomplish that. Statistically, Afghanistan has the highest global terrorism index, but the U.S. actually comes just below Iran and just above Greece in these numbers. It is surprising to a lot of Americans to find out that the U.S. is not even remotely the safest country and the most immune to terrorism. American exceptionalism has led us to believe that terror is something that happens to us, not from us, but that is not true. The U.S. creates a lot of terror across the globe and internally. So I spoke to a human geography professor about the trends of terrorism over the past 2 decades, and you can see in this chart that it's quite all over the place, but they tend to trend in cycles. This professor indicated that the ties we have to our identity, which is called identity politics, increases our likelihood to commit acts of terrorism. A study conducted by Afghan researchers found that when identity political views were more prevalent in the community, the more extremist values were held, and then the more terror-aligned the groups and the communities were. When people view others' political choices as attacks on a theoretical us, they are more likely to react in a way that is defensive, and it may seem disproportionate to outsiders. It's important to recognize that extremist values are coming from a perceived threat, that it is a defense mechanism brought about by actual or perceived persecution. Terrorist organizations co-opt this kind of extremist thinking, and they use it to consolidate power that benefits the organization. It's very similar to a cult in that way, in that the people who are involved in these organizations may hold values that are very different from what the organization is actually doing. The UN suggests that we make sure that when we are addressing terrorist policies that we're looking at both women and children who are indoctrinated into groups like Boko Haram, who use sexual violence against women to coerce them into continuing to be a part of a terrorist organization and to commit terroristic acts. Understanding if the terrorist actually holds extremist values is going to become important later when we talk about de-radicalization. But first, before we get to that, I want to look at what it means to be a terrorist to different people. This is, in the bottom right corner, is a Russian band called Ice Peak, and they make quite political art. They were actually listed by the Russian government as extremists of interest because they were inciting hatred of the Russian government. They were a bit critical. Enemies of states do not have to be real threats to them. Basically, governments can label any group a terrorist organization and any time that it wants for basically no reason. There's no need to prove evidence of terrorist acts if a government can exert enough control on a population. So when Russia recently declared Meta as an extremist group, they are the company that owns Facebook and Instagram. They are not causing any harm to civilians. They are not using anything to attack or coerce. They really don't fit the proper understanding of extremists and terrorists, but the Russian government has cited them as that anyway. It is really important to realize that when we call things terrorists, it's not just a word that we can throw around, but governments have created the idea of terrorism in their own place. So really looking at what an organization is doing rather than what they're called is really important to understanding who we have to address first and where the issues are actually lying. State sponsors of terrorism are another way in which we can see how our language and development of who we call terrorists is really important. So the US government says that state sponsors of terrorism are Syria, Iran, Cuba, and North Korea. That these specific countries are state sponsors of terrorism. I could find very, very little evidence that the US has ever publicly acknowledged that they are themselves state sponsors of terrorism in the Middle East. They funded the Taliban in Afghanistan. They funded Al-Qaeda in Pakistan in efforts to decrease stability there and basically get back at the Soviet Union in the 80s. This has destabilized an entire region, and this covert funding of, counter-Soviet terrorist operations has backfired so badly that it has killed American citizens. The U.S. does not recognize its role in the creation of its own worst enemies. There are a couple different power types that we can look at here as well. First, we can see visible power. These are things that are written down in policies, blatantly said that people understand. So these are, current policies like the Patriot Act that allows the U.S. government to more fully surveil the American population in order to deter terrorism. The Department of Homeland Security and the FBI all have websites dedicated to counterterrorism measures, and seeing what they say about terrorism is another indication of visible power. Hidden power, on the other hand, comes in two kind of flavors. First, de-radicalization efforts. Now, these can be done through therapy, through group support in areas that are typically experiencing a lot of extremist values. Grassroots organizations that work within communities in the Middle East and in America to de-radicalize people have a very strong amount of power that even people in the community might not even be able to recognize. On the other hand, hidden power like misinformation campaigns that are brought about by U.S. Government and politicians have been like a really big source of tension in American politics. Louisiana State Representative David Duke used to have Holocaust denial propaganda in his official office in Louisiana, and he would sell this for a profit. And this type of misinformation about the Holocaust being not real does fall under some definitions of extremist values. And this is a politician going out of his way to provide extremist literature. And while he's not explicitly saying that he agrees with this, the hidden power of having someone in government that is specifically aligned with white supremacy and that type of terrorist organizations is quite frightening. But the last type of power here is invisible power. And this is power that comes from cultural norms and expectations. And you can see this really blatantly in the idea of American exceptionalism, that America is free from extremism, or that the people who do commit extremist acts are one-offs, that they are crazy people, that they are troubled. It is not fair to understand our alignment with domestic terrorism as one-offs. Culturally, we have created an environment that has led more and more people to feel so passionate about committing atrocities. American exceptionalism has gotten people killed because of this, because we have not been able to reasonably address the causes of domestic terrorism. When we talk about misinformation, I want to bring up this ABC News article that had this map of ISIS expansion 5-year plan, and that it was to be, the biggest sweep of Islamic nationalism the world has ever seen. It was going to kill, millions. It was going to take all of Spain even. This map did not originate from any ISIS members. It didn't originate in the Middle East. It didn't originate in Spain. None of the countries involved were involved in making this map. Instead, an alt-right group called the Third Position created this map to specifically fearmonger amongst their members that ISIS was a growing threat. And while ISIS was a growing threat, this misinformation made people unreasonably nervous, unreasonably threatened. And ABC News has left this map up since then with no warnings, no disclaimer that what they have said in the article is blatantly factually incorrect and fact-checkable. There is no merit to this map. And major media corporations spreading misinformation is a danger to counterterrorism efforts. But it's not just the media, it is also US government. So this, in the background, is the Counterterrorism Guide by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Up here is a little list of all of the places a terrorist group can be from: Africa, Asia, Europe, Middle East, and Southeast Asia, which unfortunately has the gaping problem of an entire Western Hemisphere missing. There is no reason to believe that there is no extremist groups, no terrorist groups in America. There are, and we have witnessed their attacks on American citizens. The refusal to identify that in the Counterterrorism Guide is frightening, because it gives people a false sense of security, and it breeds xenophobia and anti-Muslim sentiment. And on the right here is the FBI and the Director of Homeland Security's list of, again, where you can see extremist groups. The top, the FBI had just the United Kingdom and no mention of the United States at all. And the one below it, the Department of Homeland Security, did not mention any predominantly white country. I've made this little chart to showcase what we can do to combat terrorism. First, we need to combat misinformation. We need to be able to prove and disprove the facts of how terror is occurring and how extremist propaganda is spreading. Then we need to educate communities. We need to identify at-risk communities that are heavy in identity politics and that are growing more extreme. Then we need to have inclusive political systems. This represents democracy. This represents a place where people's voices are heard, and that all countries are uplifting the democratic power of other countries. Political systems and government stability are predominantly an internal thing, but they can be helped with funding and trading agreements. So moving on to colonial reparations, the coloniality of Africa in the 19th century had destabilized it so aggressively that terror has continued to percolate throughout the region, including spreading over and mingling with Islam revisionist extremists. The colonial era of Africa and then eventually the destabilization of the Middle East in the 80s bred a place where extremism and violence could grow. And we need to do everything we can to fix the problems that we have created by pulling rapidly out of periphery countries. These countries have been extremely reliant on our economic systems. They have been extremely highly specialized. So these communities are places that do not have the resources to continue an economy, to feed their people, to pay their workers. And that has, again, created more instability. And that is the place where terrorism occurs. And lastly, the UN needs to have more specific and direct dedication to de-radicalization and reintegration as part of their counterterrorism program. They don't give too many outlines of specific rules and regulations for how counterterrorism should be handled, just guides. I would like to see more strong sanctions on governments that use terror against terror organizations, which we'll get to again in a minute. So When we talk about de-radicalization, we're talking about a process that is going to take extremists back from the edge, back from violence, and understand why people are joining these extremist organizations, and then we ultimately need to deprogram them from a terrorist organization. So a lot of terror organizations recruit people through deceptive means, coercion, violence. Boko Haram uses sexual violence to take women into the organization. And so understanding why people are joining and how that is different for every individual person is really key to de-radicalization in that manner. De-radicalization can come in a couple different ways. So we can start with informational campaigns, making sure that people understand that what they're seeing on the news, like ABC News's false information, that might not be the whole story, or if it is, understand the horrors of terror and what it's doing to people. Educating people on having more global focused minds can help reduce the concept of identity politics, that holding onto your identity is so strongly important that you have to kill for it. Education can help release that tension. And then governmental programs can help broadly fund de-radicalization efforts. This isn't going to come at a cost of zero. It's going to be expensive to hire and train extremely specialized therapists and make sure that people who are going through the de-radicalization process cannot hurt anybody. And then we need to reintroduce these people. A lot of people, especially Americans, including myself, are a bit wary of reintroduction of terrorist groups, and that is by all means understandable. These people have committed atrocities, but it is really important to understand that there are evidence-based practices for taking a terrorist out of that organization and getting them to a level where they are not a threat to themselves, not a threat to anybody else, and that they do not hold extremist values anymore. A study conducted at Guantanamo Bay found that after an inmate's prison sentence was served and they took a 12-week inpatient program for de-radicalization, they did not have any recurrences of extremist behavior. But lastly, we need to make sure that we focus on maintaining humanitarianism even when countering terrorism. The U.S. Killed 2,000 civilians with roadside bombs in the Middle East, and this was under the guise of protecting the world from terrorist organizations. If you remember at the start of the lesson, I defined terrorism as something that's going to target civilians. The U.S. government targeted civilians in order to decrease terrorism, then committed acts that could be seen as terrorism. Instead, the UN wants us to recognize these complex histories of the region, understanding why they're so unstable, and focus on aid rather than control or retaliation. Committing acts of terrorism is not the way to decrease global terrorism. Instead, we need to support local efforts. It's not going to be easy to fight terrorism, but we need to maintain evidence-based practices for it. Radicalization is the best path forward. Major economic capitals like the US, we have to use our power to lift up de-radicalization efforts, both domestically and abroad. Thank you.